Hello and thanks for watching this Cloud9 ERP Solutions video and subscribing to our YouTube channel. In this series of videos for Acumatica Financial Fast Track Implementation, we're going to talk about accounts payable. Now, it's important to note that our Fast Track Implementation series is designed for the very basics to get you operational and give you the ability to process accounts payable and your financials in Acumatica. This doesn't fit every business, and some businesses may require a more advanced implementation. So let's get started. If we click on Payables, we can see all of our menu items. And the first thing we want to get started with is our vendor classes. So we have no vendor classes in here. We're going to create our first one. And what a vendor class is, and the term class in Acumatica is used as category. But it's not just for reporting purposes, as typically a category would be used for reporting purposes. You can run a aging report, for example, and categorize it by a certain selection of vendors, vendor classes. But vendor classes go a step further in that they help you create new vendors. And what I mean by that is, when you create a new vendor and you select the class, Acumatica can fill in this information for you so you don't have to every single time you create a vendor. So let's get started. We're only going to create one vendor class here, but we'll create one and we'll just call it a default. That'll be our fallback. And we'll give it a description of the same. And the country is optional. Again, this will get filled in when we create a new vendor record. We can give it a default tax zone ID if we're using tax, VAT taxes on the AP side of things. We can give it specific shipping terms if we have them set up. Typically, this is for distribution, but the shipping terms give you the ability to define what are the terms, how do you want this to be shipped by your vendor. So we'll leave that alone. And this is also if you're using purchase receipts and orders. We're not going to turn that on right now. This is just financials. And then the next thing is terms, vendor terms. So the terms could be, for example, you have 30 days to pay your vendor, net 30, or it's due on receipt, or it's COD. So if we do a lookup here, you're not going to see any terms because we haven't created them yet. So let's create our first credit term in the system. So when we open this up, notice I hit the pencil key. When we open this up, we get the ability to define our terms ID. Now, you could define this any way you'd like, but typically net 30 is used as net 30 with no spaces. N30 might be another way to do it, but you could choose your own way of naming these. Then I'll give it a description, net 30. Now this description will show up everywhere in Acumatica. It'll also show up on documents. And then the next option is visible to. So unlike other systems, Acumatica allows you to create the terms in one place and use them for vendors and customers. So we could leave this as all unless we wanted to restrict this term, unless it was specific to vendors. So we'll leave it as all. And then due date type is a fixed number of days. Now you have a lot of options here, but fixed number of days is what we need to say that we're going out 30 days, and that's when this document will be due. So we'll go over here and we'll put 30, and we'll save it. Now, if we wanted to create another one, for example, if we pay in 10 days, we can get 2% off. That looks like this. So typically you use some sort of naming convention so that people know what it is. In Acumatica, it's easy to find a terms. You don't need to know the code, just like you don't need to know the vendor code, for example, because you can search the description on the fly and the system will find it. So for the description of this, it's net 30, 2%, 10 days, meaning we have to pay it in 30 days, but if we pay it in 10 days, you get 2% off. So that reads the same way, 30 here under due date settings, but our cash discount settings will be 10 and then 2%. So from there, that'll give you a lot of examples of what you can create. But those are two terms that we have there. And additionally, we maybe could create a due on receipt. Or some people use COD. And there we could just leave it alone at 0. So our vendor class, if we go back, every time we create a vendor and we select default as the vendor class, it's choosing US as the country. We don't have to type that in. It's choosing a default term of due on receipt, but let's change that to net 30. And then it's choosing a payment method. The payment method is in here. We can choose check as the default payment method. You may choose to have two different types of check methods. You might have one that's a print paper check and maybe one that's a bill pay. That's up to you. And then cash account. What is the default cash account? Meaning, what checking account are we writing this check out of? And you can choose the one that we created in our cash management. Lastly, the payment's due by the due date or the discount date. So based on that, you can have your check run automatically sort based on one of these dates. So you have that option. We'll leave it as due date, and we'll save this. So now we have our first vendor class. The next thing we want to do is go into our accounts payable preferences and set those up. So the first section is numbering settings. And Acumatica has numbering settings for batches, and it has numbering settings for bills or for debit adjustments. That's a credit back from the vendor. Credit adjustment, that's an extra bill from the vendor, the reverse of what you'd expect for customers. Your payment numbering sequence. Now, this is not the check number. This is the document number in Acumatica for each payment. And if you're doing pricing, price worksheets, a document number for that. Now, the numbering sequences look like this. If we click on this pencil again, this time it's going to open up the preferences for the AP bill, not create a new one because there's something selected here. So we'll click the pencil and we could see our AP bill numbering sequence. So at the top, there's a numbering ID, and then you have the description, AP bill. We have automatic numbering turned on. If we didn't, we'd turn on this checkbox here, and then we would type in the AP bill number every single time. But just like the check number, this is not the invoice number. This is Acumatica's internal AP bill reference number, the number that we have internally. The vendor's invoice number is a separate field. So deciding whether or not you want to do manual numbering, most customers don't, is up to you, but typically this is automatically generated. And then when you first start to create a bill, this is the text you'll see in the document reference field until you hit the save button, and then it generates. Now, what it generates, the number it generates, is up to you down here below. So we have some numbering here. There's a start number, an ending number. There's a starting date, that is to say when it's effective. There's the last number. We haven't created any AP bills, so that's why that's 0. And then you can have a warning number and a step. So if I delete this and I start my own, I could do a number of things here. I could say, well, I want my invoice number, my AP bill reference number, internal number, to start off with maybe 10,000. And when I hit the tab key, Acumatica knows the number of digits and it automatically fills in the rest. So I'm starting with 10,000. I'm ending with 99,999. I'm starting the beginning of time, according to this. And my last number is going to be the first number, 10,000. And then Acumatica is proposing a warning number at 99,899. Now, you have the ability to have a numbering step also. In some cases, you may want to pick and skip by a certain number. Keep in mind, this numbering sequence is going to help you throughout Acumatica. It's not just for accounts payable. So later, for example, for customer invoices or for customer numbering, you're going to use the same similar looking screen, but to create those numbering sequences. So you can do that. The other thing you could do is you could say maybe B 10,000. And maybe you want that so that it references a bill. So Acumatica will acknowledge the letter in front of the number, and it'll continue to keep that with the preceding B. So you have a few options here. I'm going to go back. I'm going to make this nice and simple. And I'm going to start with 10,000, and I'm going to save it. So when we go back, you can feel free to configure this any way you want. And just make sure that one of the things that could come up is if you change these last numbers and you have some sort of collision, you won't be able to create a document. So just keep that in mind when you're fussing with this and creating your numbering sequences. So under the posting settings, we want to automatically post when we release. Acumatica has a term of release. We talked about it in the financial, the general ledger section. So when you hit release, it releases it to the general ledger. And what this means is that it'll automatically post the general ledger entries. The next option is to post a summary on updating GL. So Acumatica by default will throw all of the detail into the general ledger. This is very helpful because when you're looking at a GL entry, you can see all the detail you ever wanted, and you can open up the original document. So for example, if something's hitting an expense account, you can go right back down to the AP bill just by a few clicks. So we like to keep this off. Migration mode is something that we talk about during Go Live, and the ability to import open accounts payable bills, but without triggering GL transactions. We'll still get our aging report, but we won't actually offset any AP balances. So the accounts payable account, we don't want to increase that when we bring this in because we're going to do that through the trial balance. For additional details, go to our financial fast track video. Allow bill reclassification. What that allows you to do, it's like a copy and paste. As you post bills, you're going to hit GL accounts for classifying your expenses. Acumatica allows you to turn this on so you can go into any AP bill and reclassify where it'll create the counting entries. So it'll pull away from the expense account that you made a mistake on and create a new expense GL entry to the one you want to make to. So that's bill reclassification. We're not going to go over that in this Fast Track series, but that's what that is. Your default aging settings, typically this is 30, 60, and 90. We'll set that up. In the preferences, you can define the default vendor class. This is helpful so that when you create a vendor, you don't always have to select the vendor class. Acumatica has a default payment lead time. When you're doing a check run, when you're processing all your bills into checks, Acumatica gives you some filters here where you can use this lead time to your advantage. So if you know that you want to get the check delivered by a certain amount of time, it'll use this payment lead time. Acumatica also has payment lead times inside the vendor, so you can change it there as well. Hold document on entry is if you wanted the document to be on hold, so you'd have to take it off hold before you could release it. Most customers don't have this on. Require approval of bills prior to payment. We're going to turn that off. We're not going to cover that in our payables fast track. Early checks allows you to pay bills that are posted to future periods. Validate document totals gives you a box that you can fill in the amount. So for example, if you were creating a bill that added up to $1,500, there's another box where you could type in $1,500 to confirm that that's what you were looking for. That's the number you were looking for. The zero payment amount is similar to the validate document totals. What it does is it totals up the application section, the detail section of the bill, and it'll fill it up in the summary section. This is more clear when you start looking at AP bills. For now, we can leave it alone. It's not a critical setting. Require vendor reference means that you have to put the invoice number in. We like that. And you can also have Acumatica raise an error message if you happen to put a duplicate vendor reference number in, the invoice number for the vendor. And if you happen to put that in, you'll get an error message. So we'll hit the save button on this. We're not going to go into pricing or 1099 settings. So the next thing we want to do is create our first vendor, and then I'll show you an import. So if we go into new vendor, we can get to it from here as well. And vendors will give you a list of vendors. We don't have any, but you can scroll to the right and click new. So our vendor ID is manual. Notice it's asking, it's not saying new here. It's not going to automatically generate. So we could type in a vendor ID, maybe that's 1000 here, and we can continue along. Or what we can do is we can go into segment keys. So what segment keys allow you to do is they allow you to modify the key length. So what do I mean? Well, if we do a lookup here, there's a lot of keys already in the system. And if we go over to business account, so business accounts are shared through customers and vendors. And if we click on this one, you can see that Acumatica supports a length of 10 for our business account ID, meaning the vendor code or the customer code could be a total length of 10. And that might be fine for you, but if you need to change that, you can come over here and maybe make it bigger. Maybe you need to make it 15. When you save it, you're good to go. Now, the other thing under segment keys are our customers and our vendors. And notice there's a numbering ID here, but it's not selected. So this is where we tie together the numbering sequence for a vendor. You won't find it in the payable preferences or the receivable preferences. It's shown here. Now, we don't have a numbering sequence for vendors, so let's click the pencil here and create our own. We'll call this vendors. And we're going to leave it as automatically numbering. I like the greater than, less than, new. And we'll go over here and we'll do our numbering sequence. Now, this is a good example of why we might put a letter in front of our numbering sequence. You might not do it for customers, but for vendors, this will allow you to keep track of the idea that the vendor IDs are different than the customer IDs. So we'll save this. And now we have a numbering ID here. And we want to check this box here for the segment. There's only one segment. We want to check this box for auto number. Notice there are other options here about the alignment, about whether you're converting the case. You can change these things, but with auto numbering, this will be automatically based on the numbering ID. So we'll save this, and if we go back and we refresh, notice Acumatica now says new here. Maybe it's Sales Tax Authority. Pick our GL account for cash, discount, and our accounts payable account. None of these were set up in the vendor class. And save it. Now notice what Acumatica did. It's putting an automatic numbering for the vendor. Now, a couple other things. The first one is under vendor class, we skipped over it. But if you go to your GL accounts, this is where you can select those default accounts that we had to pick manually. This is the cash discount account. If you pay within that period and you get the discount from the vendor, this is the revenue account that will give you that money back. Of course, in Acumatica, you can pick any account you want. So if you prefer to use an expense account and back it out and then use that account for something else, that's fine too. The other thing I wanted to talk about is under our vendor, we created an example of a sales tax authority. Now, this could be any state where you have a nexus to collect sales tax and pay the state for it. So to do that, you want to check this box here. Vendor is a tax agency. That'll give you this setting here, which turns on. And it allows you to set up your tax payable account, what the period type is for paying these taxes. Are they quarterly or monthly? That's typical. And any of the other tax settings, which we'll go over in the sales tax session. Let's go back to vendors so we can see our list of vendors. We only have the one, and as you continue to create, you'll see your vendors here, and you could do lookups, not only from here, of course, but also when you're creating a new bill. Now that we have vendor data in, our payables preferences are set up, we have some terms, let's create a bill. to show how this is working. So we'll click the new button here and we'll tab over. We have our March 7th date. It's today's date. The period is automatically being defined for us because the date falls within the period. And our vendor reference number, we'll make something up here. We can do a lookup to find our vendor, or we can search. And we can come down here and put in an amount. So let's say this is a $500 bill. The GL account is not defaulting. Remember, we left that blank, but we can pick an expense account. Advertising expense. And over here, we can enter the amount manually. It's part of that validation. And this bill is ready to get posted. Now, keep in mind, one of the things you want to do before I save this, as we're implementing Acumatica, we want to be able to test the system. We want to be able to post. We want to be able to do checks to make sure that the system is working correctly before we turn it over to our employees and we go live with it. But the last thing you want to do is create transactions that you can't delete. Once you post a bill, you can't delete it out of the system. But what we want to do is open this tenant up and make a copy to make test transactions. This will help us because we can create as many test transactions as we want. And later, as we're continuing our implementation, we can go back to our main implementing company, continue on, and then do a copy again and again. So let's insert a tenant here. We'll call this Acme tenant test data. And we'll use the same for the login name. And we'll save it. Now we have our test tenant here. You can see it under the tenant list. If we open up our tenant ID, this is the one we've been implementing. So far we have financials, cash, and we're working on payables. We have a couple of vendors in there. We'll click here and we'll copy our tenant to our test data tenant. We'll click OK here. And now, if we close this and we go up here and sign out, we can sign into our test data company and do a brand new bill. Give it a vendor invoice number. Pick the vendor. Give it an amount. Give it a GL account. And release it. So now what we've done is we've created a bill. If we go to payables, we can go into our AP aging, run the report, and you could see our vendor with the one bill that's outstanding. Of course, right now it's current, but it'll go through the different aging buckets as time goes on. Now, the next thing we could do to finish off our testing is print a check. So if we go to payables, and we open up that bill, we could do it from there, or we could do it from our check process screen. But there's no need since there's really only one bill we're processing. But if we click pay, we can now see our new check record. This is recording a single check to a single invoice. So you can see what we're applying. We're applying it to this bill. We can change the amount we want to pay if we only want to pay a partial. And you notice the status is pending print. So let's hit the print process button here. Because this is a check run, because we're printing this check out, Acumatica will ask us the next check number. Now, where that's set up where the check run is set up, because you may be recording payments manually. That's under banking. So if we take a step back to our banking implementation and we look at our payment methods, you can see here under check, settings for accounts payable. Notice the payment method allows us to use it in AP. We can uncheck that here. Of course, this is what we're using it for. But settings for use in AP says to print checks. So you can click not required. You can create another payment method, maybe just for online payments, and say not required. And then you could do all this manually and not have to go through that check process. It's important to note that's how that works. Now, if we go back to continue our check printing process, we can put a number in here. After you get things started, the cash account will store the next check number in it for you. So we'll click process here. And depending upon your browser settings, you may have a PDF form that may open up. In my case, it downloaded. So we can open up this PDF and print it out. Or you can use the HTML. We recommend PDF for check form because a check form is so finicky about where exactly things need to line up, as opposed to HTML. HTML, by the way, is this option right here, which will show it on the screen. And for this check form, you can use our Acumatica Report Designer and modify the form to match your check forms. You can see this is the body of the check at the top, and there's two remittance at the bottom. So the two perforated lines, typically 3-part check. We currently have the two on the bottom, but your form may differ. But nonetheless, if I go back to the previous tab, so this is the tab, you can't see the tabs here, but there's another tab here which has come up, and it now gives me 3 options, and one of them is to release the check. That's assuming everything printed out fine and I'm comfortable with the check. But I also have some reprint options in case I either destroyed the check form or I have blank paper and I just want to reprint it again. So I'll release this. And what we want to do in our testing is just basically check and make sure. We want to go back and we open up this check. Under financial, you can get to the GL batch, so you can start to see things flowing into your financials, and you can see the transactions. It's important to check this, and the same thing goes for the bill. We open it up, and we open up the financial batch. This will give us an idea of what our debits and credits are and how they're affecting the GL. And it's important to notice this and make sure you have it right before you start laying down transactions in a live environment. So that's accounts payable, fast track implementation. If you have any questions about this or anything else fast track or anything else Acumatica, please reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks again for watching and subscribing, and have a